Hello everyone, welcome to the week 6, or it's the 6th week, but for you it will be the 8th week because this semester's the 5 and 7 split. So this is the week 8 lecture part 1. This one will deal with assessment principles. So we'll be going through quite a few foundational concepts, acknowledging of course that there's way more in assessment in science and primary learning more broadly than can be covered in a lecture. So it'll be guiding you through and pointing you towards resources in many respects. But the second lecture for this week is actually a full breakdown of the marking rubric for assessment 1. So I'll go through the template, the task description, the marking rubric and the template. So that one is a must watch, particularly as you start preparing for the submission of the first assessment task. You'll see where your gaps are. You'll understand what's really required of you in the assessment task. So it's definitely worth looking at individually or as a group. Ideally, both would be the way to go. So start with this one, but definitely look at the second one after you finish with this. So in this first part, we'll be looking in this recording at assessment in science education and catering for diversity in science education as well. There's a recap of cross-curricular integration, but that's going to be skipped, I think, for efficiency's sake here. These things do relate quite closely, the themes of diversity and assessment in science education. So let's begin. So let's just start off with a broad definition of parameters here. So what do we mean by assessment? So, just to read off the slide here, you'll forgive me, assessment is the broad name for the collection and evaluation of evidence of a student's learning at any stage in the process. When we talk about evidence, that is very broadly defined. It does not need to be formal. It could be your notes, it can be your thoughts, it can be things they've said. So it is multimodal and it can range from very informal to very formal. And we'll talk about that a bit as well. It is integral to teaching and learning because it serves multiple purposes. It serves the students, it serves you, it enhances the teaching and learning environment, it allows for different decisions to be made. It can also feed up, of course, into nationwide stats like your NAPLAN results and things like that as well. Unfortunately, we tend to think about assessment through the prism of those large national assessments. They tend to be the least useful for teaching and learning purposes. And of course, we know the New South Wales Education Standards Authority is kind of the arbiter of this. They're the ones that monitor this. They do the accountability work, but they also provide guidance on what this should look like in the classroom. So assessment is having different forms and it serves different masters here. So assessment, again, provides opportunities for teacher to gather evidence about achievement in relation to those outcomes. This doesn't necessarily mean a post-test. It can be work samples. It can be works in progress, portfolio kind of work as well. Anything that you can point to say, this is my evidence. It can be qualitative, meaning it's the human. It can be written. It can be pictures. It doesn't have to be numbers on a page and test scores. It doesn't have to be quantitative. It enables students to demonstrate what they know and what they can do. So again, it is usually an expression of their progress towards the outcomes, and depending on the verbs, what the evidence is will change. So if you want students to critically evaluate, multiple choice quizzes aren't going to do it. It's just not going to happen. Clarify students' understanding of concepts and promotes a deeper understanding. So the act of engaging with assessment does deepen understanding. It is integral. It's really hard to separate teaching, learning and assessment. They're all kind of linked in a sense. Some could argue that assessment and the collection of evidence is just a byproduct of teaching, and it is. We just want to make that, put you in a position where you can take advantage of the data that's just almost naturally collected and be strategic about it. And it provides evidence of current understanding that can be used as a suitable basis for future learning. NAPLAN and these sorts of things tend to be released months and months after the assessment takes place, which makes them quite useless. Kids develop so quickly, young people develop so quickly that it's essentially a snapshot in time. So those big assessments give us broad trajectories across education systems. I do like that TIMS does that, but you can't use that for classroom practice. Assessment should be based on syllabus outcomes. We've talked about this extensively. It should be valid in a sense. And what we mean by that for your purposes, we could go the research route, but let's not, is to say that the assessment is a valid reflection of what that outcome is asking for. And for our purposes, are the nouns and verbs what we're looking for? Is the content what we're looking for? And is the verb reflected in this? So if students design something, are they actually designing it? I mean, we have to do it up here as well with our subject outlines. We need to include criteria to clarify students what aspects of learning are being assessed. This could be minor, this could be a design brief, it could be a rubric, particularly for those summative assessments. They need to know what they're being assessed on. It shouldn't be guess what's in my teacher's head. I'm sure you've experienced that. We call it black box assessment. But guessing what is in your lecturer's head or your teacher's head is incredibly frustrating and is not really a marker of learning. You might just accidentally stumble into it. So again, and be reliable as well. So generally, for summative assessment tasks, we want them to be reasonably consistent, meaning they produce similar results at that point in time amongst students. It's not entirely gut feeling. Oh, I like that student. Fine, I think they're a good student. So it gives us a level of accountability to ourselves and our students. And it helps to mitigate bias by having clearly defined assessment protocol. Like in EMS207, those rubrics are pretty detailed. It allows me to go, well, this is what the work is. So yes, you may have not shown up to class, but it's still very good work. You will get the mark you deserve, ideally not tainted by the bias of the markers too much. I mean, there's always an element of it. They should be free from bias where possible, although I would argue there's always an element of bias, but we want to mitigate that and give places where we can discuss outcomes and evidence and those sorts of things. Enable students and teachers to use feedback. So we want them to be a mechanism and a driver of feedback, between stakeholders. It can be from teacher to student to teacher, and all sorts of things, because we want ultimately the assessment to be a catalyst for feedback to improve learning. That's the whole purpose of this, ultimately. We want it to be inclusive and accessible, so we like different modes to be part of this. That's why group learning comes into this, different forms of, you probably saw that with some of the instructional strategies as well. And we want it to be a part of ongoing monitoring over time. That's why the 5Es has the different types of assessment, different purposes. It can't just be, at the end of the unit, here's the test. It can't be. So if I can move you, if you've got that thought and I can move you away from that, I think I've done my job. So there's a couple of different modes here, and we'll present these in different ways. But the first one is assessment for learning. So this usually occurs before the assessment, before the learning process begins. It's our diagnostic assessment, and gives us a sense of where students are as they head into a learning cycle, be it a lesson or a unit or whatever you define it as. It typically includes some goals for the learning activity. So what we're here to achieve, what are we doing? So when you ask a student in group learning, what are we here to achieve? And they don't go, I don't know, blowing stuff up. Provides effective feedback and a baseline, in a sense, to monitor ongoing improvement. And it reflects a belief that students can improve. The strange thing that I've come across with this is, in my teaching, and admittedly this was years ago now, students were, particularly in my gift and talented class I taught, not used to this idea of diagnostic or assessment before learning. It stressed them out tremendously. And so I did a small diagnostic quiz on the structure of the Australian government. And the class average was 2 out of 15, which I expected it to be. And I had to sort of stand in front of the class and talk to them about what I was trying to do, because some students were crying at getting low marks. And I said, well, this isn't going in the report. I'm trying to work out what you do and don't know. And if they'd gotten an average mark of 15 out of 15, I probably could have guessed that someone had already taught them that. So it was for me helping them to understand that I didn't want to waste their time by teaching them things they already knew, or if there were specific gaps, I could focus more on those. So strangely enough, they weren't used to this in any way, or as much as they should have been, potentially. So again, it almost humbled them, really, but they did go on to get good marks in the post-test. Encourages students. So the next one is assessment as learning. So that formative assessment is occurring during the learning process. Also more informal, but can take different forms. It can be you writing notes, it could be them doing self-reflections, it can be work samples, works in progress, portfolios and those sorts of things. But it allows students to take responsibility for their own learning because they can become part of that assessment process. They see that as a vital part, not distinct. And we struggle with that at uni sometimes to this day, where the assessment sits on the side. It used to drive me up the wall if I had lecturers back in the day who would not talk about the assessment. They would say, oh, that's something for you to do outside of class. And you'd be sitting there going, I don't see the link between the tutorials and the assessment. And they almost said, well, that's by design. I'm going to teach you what I want, and then you do the assessment. It was crazy. I don't think it happens as much anymore, but it did. I thought if it was happening in teacher education, I can't imagine what was going on elsewhere. So it involves students and teachers creating learning goals to encourage growth and development. So, things they're working towards long-term and short-term. Provides students ways for students to use formal and informal feedback and self-assessment, so that ongoing monitoring of the self, and encourages that sort of reflective side of education that we like as well for long-term development. For independence and autonomy when you're gone, do they have the way of self-assessing? And of course, assessment of learning is what we always think of it. The big thing we think of with assessment, has this been successful? Have they achieved the outcomes? So it is used to plan future goals and pathways. So it doesn't just end there. It can still be a way to reflect on learning as well. Provides evidence of achievement for everyone involved, the wider community, parents, educators. This is where we have stuff in the school. We have those sort of NAPLAN components. We have the high school certificate, or whatever it's currently called, ATARs, UAIs, those sorts of things. So it's that idea of wider accountability that becomes part of it as well, and provides usually a transparent interpretation, so we can see why they've come to that grade and where they should go from here. So this is the idea of it being reliable and valid. So usually slightly more informal, but these are the terms. I prefer this framing: diagnostic, formative, and summative. So diagnostic before the learning, formative during the learning, summative after the learning. They're not, the structure of them can be similar. So these are, think of it this way: this is your purpose for the assessment, and then the separate question is, what is the form of the assessment? Is it written drawings the whole time? Is it questioning the whole time? Is it a test here and a question here and a cage world chart here? I don't know. But we have to remember the form and the purpose are different things, and they can intertwine. You can use the same form for different purposes. But if you can nail this to the wall and get this in your schema, you'll be moving in the right direction. So diagnostic assessment, it's pre-assessment, it's prior knowledge, it's seeing what the strengths and weaknesses the students have, it's setting that foundation for later reflection and those sorts of things. Examples include, you can have a pre-test like I've done in the past, you could do a survey, you could have a brainstorm, class discussion. Any activity that involves an expression of ideas, visually, verbally, or in writing. Drawing, we saw that with the 5Es lecture, the idea of drawing a diagram and labelling it. Having the old butcher's paper out with a brainstorm, that can work. Why not bring technology into it? As long as we can capture it and come back to it later, that it is not just spoken into the ether and never comes back. You can write notes in your day book. That's part of it as well. So we like diverse forms of assessment, but these shouldn't be hugely onerous. You shouldn't be doing massive pre-tests for every activity, every lesson. They can be more informal. The formative is, of course, monitoring students' learning during the process, because we'd rather find out things are going off the rails early than getting to the end and going, that was a disaster, whoops. We'd rather adjust the learning during the process if we can. So it provides information to adjust the learning and teaching if needed. When the teacher says, hey, this didn't work, like the class was off task, we're going to do this next time. We're going to reel in the group learning, and we're going to structure that more. Check for student understanding, it informs future instruction, and it's continuous and ongoing. These often become a routine part of it. I know in Bacchus campus we use the Harvard 1-minute papers. People stop engaging with them after a while usually, but they're there as a form of progress monitoring. And students and the teacher are provided with feedback. That's the important thing. Examples can include work samples. If you're doing any text work in your text, pulling out and writing something, you're generating work samples on a daily basis, generally. You can have a portfolio. This may be digital and shared with parents. You could have observation notes that you're taking, questions that you're asking and getting answers to. They could be sharing answers on things like Padlets so that they're recorded. You're doing sound bites and sharing them to a Google Cloud, Google Drive, I don't know, it's up to you. You can be doing discussions, peer and self-assessment. And then, of course, summative. Now, summative is obviously assessing whether the learning experience or the teaching learning cycle has been effective in moving the students towards the outcomes. Because we've done diagnostic assessment, we can assume they didn't come in knowing everything, so we do know that it's doing something. And this is usually more formal, grander forms of assessment. This is where you have your big project. If you're having a rubric, it's probably coming in here. If you're having a task description or a design brief, it's probably coming in here. It's usually a formal measurement of student understanding. This is usually where grades come into it. Your high distinctions, your A's, B's and C's. And is used to determine whether students have met overall outcomes for a unit of work or a sequence of lessons or something along those lines. It's usually not just after one day though. It usually happens at the end of a defined teaching and learning cycle. Look, whether that's in a 1 lesson, 3 lessons or a unit, that's up to you. You guys can define that and the scale of that in your groups for the assessment. And again, the students and teachers are still provided with feedback. Yes, the assessments you do in this subject are summative, right? You get grades, you get high distinctions, credits, passes, distinctions, fails, the whole gamut. I would still look at those at the end as a lecturer and go, hang on, why have I got so many fails? Or, I've got lots of high distinctions. Something worked here or didn't, or is the assessment too difficult or too easy? I would argue the assessment's fine though. Personally, I've been doing it for a while. So it could be an exam or end of test. It could be a big, rich task. It could be them doing a presentation in a model. It could be them, having parents come in. It could be whatever you like. Multimodality can be a part of this as well. It could be a portfolio. So they could have a final work sample they compare to earlier ones. I don't know. It's up to you. Something to think about though is the difference between norm and criterion reference assessment. In the bad old days, norm reference assessment was essentially assessment by comparison to others, like ranking. The top, and this used to happen when I was a student, I think back in 2009, 2010. So, getting closer to 20 years now. Marks would be awarded, and look, the top mark could be a credit, for example. Whatever happened, the top 5 would become high distinctions. Then the next 10 would be distinctions. It didn't matter whether the gap between 5th and 6th, so that the last high distinction, the first distinction was 1 mark or 10. Your rank determined your mark. Not a big fan of this because it's not really a performance indicator, because the highest mark could be a pass. Everyone could have gotten a high distinction. We don't know. And so it creates a competitive environment. It doesn't really tell us what those people know. It tells them what they know relative to other people. Not particularly useful in the grand scheme of things. So fortunately, we're now at this point of criterion reference assessment. So you're graded against what the expected standards are, not against other people or ideas and norms. So we have this in EMS207, and we have this broadly in education systems now, where you are only competing against yourself. And if you can teach and get every student in your class at an A, good for you, if it's a legitimate A by the standards defined. The same thing in this subject. If I can get everyone to a high distinction in Bathurst, I'm laughing. I absolutely love it. Great. As long as it is a legitimate high distinction based on clear performance standards, which we'll get into. So that's the summary of them. You can see they just match one for one. Print that one out, stick it on your wall. That's the summary of it. Another part of this is questioning, because not everything is going to be about a formal exam. We're still communicating with each other, and the way we communicate is often through asking questions. So it's vital to all forms of teaching and assessment, the interactive approach from last week. But what we want is to, when it comes to advancing learning and really moving towards the forms of assessment represented in the syllabus, because those verbs are higher order typically, we want to avoid closed or repetition-based questions. So I don't walk into a tutorial and go, name me the 5 phases, the phase of the 5 E's. It's no good. It's closed, because you can just give me those and that's the end of the discussion. So we want open questions. What would you do for an engaged phase is open, because you can make choices. There's no one answer or 2 answers to that. In your lesson plans for part B, I'd like you to consider the questions you would ask for particular activities and discussions, because part of your marking here, you're marked on your articulation of the teacher's role. So tell me the questions you ask and answer, ask and have answered, so that I know that you're not walking around going, how are you guys going? Yeah, I'm not going to ask a full-time teacher that, because they've already got the qualification. You don't yet. So we want open-ended questions, and let's think about, there are some models for this. So we don't want interaction response evaluation. Give me the first 5 E's. Student puts the first 2 stages of the 5 E's. Someone puts their hand up and goes, it's engage and explore. And I go, that's great. End of interaction. IRE questions, they can be useful for recaps or getting things back on track, but they need to be a foundation for greater questioning and discussion. They should not be the end point. Consider inserting reframing cues and analogies to help student development. So when you put in questions or prompts into your lesson plans, think about the language cues that you will use. If you hear the word stretchy, will you say elastic? When you hear the phrase it sucked up, will you say it absorbed when you're reframing it? We do it all the time in tutorials where we say, well, so this student just said this thing. And we connect and facilitate. So think about that language use and that modelling. We can use analogies, the old bike chain stuff, the sports metaphors, whatever you like. Those content representations are a big part of this. Please include your versions of those in the lesson plans. What are the teachers going to be doing? Because it ain't nothing. So a couple of examples here. You can link these to Bloom's taxonomy and the silo taxonomy, which I'll show in a second. But in the old days, 10 years before I was born, the average ratio was 50.6 teacher questions to 1.8 student questions. I wonder if that's the same now. I suspect it has changed. I suspect the teacher is probably dominant, but I don't think it's quite Harlem Globetrotters versus Washington Generals over here. I don't think it is that dominant, and that would be primarily initiate, response, evaluate questions back in the old days. Here's a couple that you can think about. If you would like to think about having some good quality questions to serve as a basis for formative diagnostic or even summative assessment, I like the ELF-SCIS model that is from the 7th edition of Scamp and Preston, which is based primarily on cueing towards scientific investigation. Okay, they are in levels, but you might create a suite of questions based on this. I think this fits really nicely in open investigation of the explore phase, but you can see certain questions start with attention focusing. So we acknowledge we need to start with foundational questions like, what is its beak like? What colour is it? You can have numbers and qualitative questions. So how far did this fish swim in 1 minute? Which mouse has the longest tail? Yes, they're defined, but they're getting them in that data collection orientation. Qualitative. What are the differences between the fish and snail? So we're starting to get that sort of idea of comparison. Action questions. What would happen if we did this thing? Posing a problem. How can we find out whether a mealworm goes underneath the bran to avoid light or to eat? This idea of observation. So these sort of play into the ELF-SCIS model here is, I think, quite a useful one because we can start to get to reasoning. So you might put in a selection of questions that you've designed based on this model in your lesson plan. It's something to think about. So what does it mean for you? Assessment's not just a post-test at the end. It's going on all the time, and your lesson plans are going to have probably all three purposes, diagnostic, formative, and summative, and you're going to have forms for that. It can't just be, I'm going to do diagnostic assessment. Well, what are you doing? The K to world chart? Are they drawing stuff? Are they putting stuff on a paddle? Are they writing stuff in their notes? It needs to have a method of data collection attached to it. If you can get the purpose and the data collection going, you're on the right track. You can also think about different, questions. Bloom's taxonomy is a nice one here because the structure of your questions can determine this. You want to start usually with a slate of questions. You want to start with more foundational things like describe who are the two main characters in the story or whatever. Give me a summary of what you just heard. Name these three things. You can start off with closed questions, but then we want to go into more complex questions. Why do you think this happened? How can we do better at this? Can you compare? What are the similarities between these two things? So think about the verbs. I keep going on about verbs, but they're really important. You can check out some syllabus links here. I believe I have one on the other screen here to look at. No, you know what? I don't want to go to them. I've decided, I did a prep before this. Go and look at them if you'd like to. Assessment is implicit in the syllabus, but we've been through it so many times, I want to actually spend some time on other things here. What are the mistakes we see in previous forms of assessment? Because having an understanding of the mistakes is, I think, actually really, it's a big part of my schema, is looking at mistakes or bad forms of assessment and how to avoid that. So one thing that drives me up the wall and drives everyone up the wall is that the criteria and expectations are not explicit. The goal of the lesson is not clear. The expectations of the lesson and the assessment are not clear. So everyone's kind of confused. It can happen in primary school, higher education, whatever you like. You've probably seen it, a bad rubric. You're sitting there and you're desperate for that high distinction and you're looking at it and it says an outstanding summary, a great summary. And you go, what's the difference? Well, the truth of it is, the difference is how many glasses of wine your marker's had or how many beers they've had. It's not useful in the learning process and you're guessing what you think they might like. You probably have a good sense of that, but it's not a good way to proceed. Content without understanding. Okay, here's multiple choice. And you do see this occasionally. You will get a poor mark if you do 3 lessons and I suddenly see a Kahoot quiz and I think, oh no, the Kahoot quiz doesn't go anywhere else. There's no group work, there's no jigsaw, there are no questions, there's no, well, we learnt this, let's ask the justification question. None of that, it's just the Kahoot quiz. 15 questions, yes or no. for the summative assessment. If you do something like that, you will not get a good mark for assessment unless in Part B. Neatness without understanding. This drives me nuts. You see people in academia read academic papers and they go, oh, gee, the formatting's bad. And you think to yourself, you've got a doctor next to your name. Why are you copy editing this? Neatness is a part of it, only to the extent that you can't interpret the information provided. We care about the outcomes in the subjects, the outcomes in the syllabus. That's our guiding star in this. Superficial time-wasting tasks, so please don't make a find a word part of your assessment. If you want to have them in your classroom as a time filler, fine, but they're not part of this assessment task in this subject. They're not part of assessment 1 or assessment 2. Guess what I want to know and I'll reward you. And I remember lecturers that didn't want to give you a rubric because they wanted you to surprise them. And you think, but I need to know reasonably what quality looks like so that I can provide it. And of course, equity is a big one here as well, that one assessment task fitting all. So there are things that I can't deviate from in terms of the assessment in these subjects, and there will be certain things that you can't avoid. Like if you're teaching literacy, students are going to have to write. But there are areas of alternate pathways here. You know, in terms of your diagnostic and formative assessment tasks, and maybe even some summative ones, you might give verbal options or shorter options or scaffolds or something like that. So how can we give students an opportunity to show what they do or don't know? So if literacy is an issue, that's, you know, in the English sense, they have literacy issues. We don't pretend that they don't, but we still want them to show what they know in science, even if they have spelling issues or whatever else. I mean, I remember a friend of mine got really low marks in an extended response because his spelling was bad, even though he'd functionally said the same thing that I'd said and I had fewer spelling errors. I remember thinking, what was the point of this? I remember him sort of talking to the teacher, I've said that, I've just spelled it badly, I'm a bad speller. But they're like, no, your spelling's bad, you fail. We're in a science class. I just had real issues with this. So again, you see the classic thing here of the very, you know, rakish young fellow here saying, the exam here is climbing the tree. The monkey's delighted, everyone else is absolutely furious. I mean, for me, you know, at university, I liked writing essays. So any time the assessment was an essay, I am grinning ear to ear. And the effect of this was it actually got me really high marks in creative arts subjects. And I can't sing, dance or do anything. My creative arts production ability was quite limited, but I took advantage of it. So, you know, think about equity and fairness. So we've been through those processes of assessment. I won't go through that again. But generally speaking, the modes of collecting assessment data exist on something of a scale from informal to more formal. You know, it's nebulous, it's not a defined thing, but you can have unstructured conversations as part of it. Now you can go and talk to a group of students, they're cranky at each other, they don't want to do the task. That's a form of data. Something's going wrong. You can have slightly structured questionnaires or observations where you're collecting and recording that data and there's some frame of reference. More structured, again, classroom tests. And of course, the most structured are examinations where all variables are controlled. They can't interact with each other, the time frame's fixed, all that sort of stuff. There is no right or wrong to all of this. It depends on what you're trying to achieve, what the purpose of the assessment is, what the outcomes are, what the traits of your students are. That notion of PCK comes into this. And our job as your tutors is to talk through this with you, really. Get your thoughts, help to organise them, provide advice and those sorts of things. So what is the relationship between teaching, learning and assessment? It's a fair point. Well, look, traditionally we've thought of it as I teach something, students learn, I assess and then I report. We know from what we've talked about with outcome-based or backward-mapped assessment, we start from where we mean to end. So that there's sort of a reverse. The way we go through the teaching and learning cycle is like this, but the way we prepare for it is the reverse. We've talked about that a little bit as well. So we know we start with the outcomes, we design an assessment, we design the learning opportunities that will help them achieve or satisfy the assessment criteria, and then we use the feedback to provide it. We don't do the traditional, here's my topic, I found it on, I don't know, bloody TikTok or Instagram, looks like fun. We'll do that as a group. I'm going to give you, I like this, tick, 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 lots of green highlights or whatever, but I've got no sense of whether this necessarily, has worked or not. So we start where we mean to end with the outcomes in the assessment. We've talked about all these sorts of things, so check those out if you'd like. There's a good quote there. And we can see how this more or less falls within the 5 E's. So generally, diagnostic assessment falls into the engage phase. Explore and explain tend to fall more towards formative. Elaborate's a bit of a pivot point where they start to move into summative. It's probably formative as well, but they move into summative, and you're particularly getting a sense of the skill development. And then, of course, evaluate is the summative assessment. So that's the alignment with the 5 E's model that you're working with. I've already got that information. We've seen the examples time and time again. You can have the discussion points where students are verbally describing. You can have them writing, which is always a lot of fun. That's why it's fun being in the classroom, getting the real thing. Been through that as well. But let's look at the effective assessment and feedback. So giving a grade or a mark is not really the core thing here. Giving feedback from that, so telling them what they could do better, what they did well, what's exciting about their work, where the opportunities for growth are. That could be verbal, could be written, could be whatever you like. The great thing about being in a tutorial or a classroom is you can do that all the time. But what we do know is if we look at Hattie, and look, he's a bit of a controversial figure, old Hattie, in classrooms, but we do know that if we go back to that notion of effect size, it has a 0.73 effect size on student learning. It is enormous. I've observed this in my own teaching at university. I've observed it in schools. And to some extent, I now think the provision of feedback is the expression of teaching expertise. It certainly is in higher education. I can record these lectures. I can put them up year after year after year. I can probably get AI to summarise some stuff for me. But what I think is best provided by an expert is the ability to react to what students are telling you. When you ask a question and I don't, and we work on and I provide feedback in that moment or on that assessment task, to me that's where the value starts to emerge, really, if it's done well. And sadly, I think it's still an afterthought in many cases. So we want these 3 principles. We want feed up, where am I going? Feed back, how am I going? And feed forward, where to next? Because obviously good feedback tells students how you've achieved that, you're against these standards, yes, this is the assessment process, where to next? Where do I want to see you go next? Is it, hey, you're up to paragraph structure? Is it, hang on, you're ready to think about sustainability? We can advance you, we can accelerate you, those sorts of things. My son was doing heaps of work on Roman numerals last year in year 1 because he just kept talking about Roman numerals. And so his teacher, who was actually one of my former students, ended up doing a bunch of stuff on the periodic table with him and Roman numerals. And, it was light-hearted rhymes and stuff like that, but it was just those in-the-moment sort of things where she was taking his interest in developing it and giving him feedback. Going through that, been through this before, don't want to cover this. Been through this as well. We talked about criterion reference assessment. Just an example here. They don't have to be massive rubrics. It could be a design brief. These are the things that I need to see. Show me this. You could do that in a joint construction method where, as a class, we go, okay, what are we going to want to see in this report or this pamphlet? Let's talk about what it needs to have. And then as a class, work through that together. That could be interesting as well. So to implement criterion reference assessment at your summative level, you need a set of indicators in the unit. So what are students going to be doing, saying, showing, producing that suggests they've achieved it? They need a way of getting some information about how well students have achieved those indicators. So they need to get a sense of their actual achievement and their progress, right? So they need feedback. They need a set of criteria for formal or for summative assessment tasks. If you're doing a big assessment task, they need to know what that looks like, what achievement looks like at the different levels. You need a set of standards. For us, it would be rubric levels, what a credit, distinction, high distinction, pass looks like. And then a marking scheme for performance. So there are some tools here that can help with this that I will point to briefly. Let me bring them up here. The 2 here, we've got Bloom's taxonomy and Solo taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is sort of the classic one here where, your assessment sort of moves through these levels, where it goes through kind of remember to... Sorry about that. My young son stepped in. It is the school holidays while I'm recording this. So you start off with the recall of facts, define, list, state, repeat. And then you move up through understanding something, applying, analysing, evaluating, and creating. So I think this is a good reference point through which to look at your assessment and what you're actually asking students to do. So if you're getting them to produce a pitch, a design pitch, or creating something in Canva or Tinkercad and justifying that, you're probably starting to move them more towards these create ideas. But my advice, link these to the syllabus. The syllabus is giving you this information. Don't need to overshoot it. Make sure they're getting to what is reflected in the syllabus. And the synonyms are actually incorporated around here as well. I've got more information on that in a future lecture. The silo taxonomy is an interesting one as well, where it sort of looks at competence in a relational sense. So it codes answers or responses at these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels. So you've got a pre-structural level where what they're saying is irrelevant. Now, it's not to say you don't value that experience and get a sense of where they're coming from, but they've got no point that is relevant to the question. Adults can do this too. At the first level, they've got a unistructural response where they've got one key idea that is correct. It might be the sun is bigger than the earth and it sits out there in space. Fantastic. Then you've got several factors that are there, but they're not really related together in terms of the verbal or written expression. Once you get to a relational understanding, the different elements are linked together. So instead of saying the sun's tilted and it rotates around the earth and then there are seasons, you say, okay, the sun's tilt is change as it rotates around the earth. And when a hemisphere is tilted towards the earth, it gets a more focused concentration of sun. So the same amount of sunlight is being spread to a smaller area, creating heat. We get to extended abstract, where they take that and apply that relational understanding to an abstract idea. So what would happen if we changed the tilt of the Earth's axis? What would this do to our experience of the seasons and heat? That idea of going beyond, create, formulate, generate. So I like the silo taxonomy quite a lot. I think it's fairly clear, and I think it complements Bloom's taxonomy quite nicely. So that's just something to sink your teeth into potentially. We can talk about designing an assessment task. I've been through this a bit. I don't want to sort of labour the point here too much. There's some classroom assessment strategies, multiple choice matching. You can do fill in the blank stuff, but I would generally use those as a basis to go further. A catalyst to go further. So you can start off with that more structured fill in the blanks sort of stuff, but you usually want to go further than that. Like I think I said last week, you can do a Kahoot quiz, but then give bonus points for giving you a justification or a secret answer that's they've got to generate. You can do flowcharts, diagrams. They're always quite good to do. Good science skill development opportunities there as well. Performance assessment can be part of this. Presentations, debates, athletic skills, showing dance, modelling, whatever you like. We talked about that with molecules as well. Solids, liquids, and gases. And then, of course, your informal assessment strategies are there as well to look at rating scales and the like. And then, of course, my favourite is obviously a large task. You can see this one here where the students are creating like a little house with a circuit in it. I mean, good hands-on activity. They can write a justification for that. They can put labels on it. Really robust task to consider. But we want to get the skill development in there as well. There's some stuff in here around work samples to look at. I won't go into too much detail on the work samples. This can help you put it in sort of greater context. Obviously, we're asking for certain things here for our assessment requirements here, but what assessment looks like and how detailed it is will vary from classroom, school to school, and you'll make adjustments. You will affect the school culture and be affected by the school culture. But you can get a sense of different work samples here. So, for example, here's a science portfolio that would be a satisfactory level for Year 4. So you can see, these are the standards. This is how they've linked it. Those are the annotations on the slide. Really nice detailed information here. They've got they've got some example charts and things like that as well. And then we can start to see, I've let go of that. Anyway, we'll leave that for now. That's worth having a look at just to develop your sort of frame of reference for what typical starts to look like or at standard starts to look like in the school system. You can develop rubrics as well. There are websites that will help with this. I won't go through them, but there's just a couple there. They still work. Generally speaking, try to avoid the very, very problem with rubrics where you're just sort of changing the adjective. So an exceptional, basic, adequate, extensive. These things don't inherently mean anything. So you could use Bloom's taxonomy or the silo taxonomy to show, is able to explain how these ideas relate together or something along those lines. So my advice would be, instead of adjectives, start with verbs and then think about the number. how things link together. Verbs and numbers are generally a better starting point than very, very sort of stuff. This is a very good assessment, a very, very good assessment. We don't want that problem. So move away from adjectives, start on good footing here. So let's talk briefly about the advantages of reusing a rubric potentially for summative assessment, perhaps incorporating one into your lesson plans for Part B. So they lower students' anxiety about the expectations. So it removes their sense of guesswork and allows them to focus on producing work of a high quality to show their abilities. So not worrying about neatness, not guessing what you want, which is wasted energy. Provide specific feedback about the quality of their work. So a well-written rubric should be able to sort of point to things that can be improved upon in the future. It provides a way to communicate expectations and progress. So they almost always form the basis of the initial kind of framing of the assessment task or the task description, the brief, whatever it may be. And it ensures that students' work is judged to the same standard. The standards derived by you from the outcomes in the syllabus. So not just things that you like, things that you are personally persuaded by, but keeps you focused on your main mission of achieving syllabus outcomes, helping your students achieve syllabus outcomes. And by extension, this sort of disengages the halo effect and its reverse. So, that you tend to want to reward the effort and positive behaviour you see in students and punish what you perceive as negative behaviours. But the truth of it is, a disengaged student can produce really high quality work, and some of your hardest working, nicest students can achieve standard work or achieving work. And we see this in higher education as well, but we want to focus on accuracy where we can. And also encourage the students to assess their own learning. Because they're not saying, well, does the teacher like it? They're saying, does it meet these standards? So it again moves them towards that notion of autonomy over time. So there's some stuff here on the ADE grading scale, which you are welcome to have a look at as well. Again, it suffers from some of the same problems. At least in the TIMS assessment, we knew that 550 moved towards this idea of applying knowledge and being able to see its relevance beyond the classroom. Even ADE scales suffer from the extensive versus thorough versus sound knowledge. I don't know what the difference between that is, but thankfully there are work samples to help us develop that sort of teaching schema as well. So that's a review of how it fits. There are some work samples and activities that you can look at here as well. These are on the old Board of Studies site, where you can kind of look at a few of these bits and pieces. I've got a couple there, but go and have a look at them. They're quite old. The outcomes are out of date, but they'll show you what the work samples start to look like there as well with design and make tasks if you are so interested. You can see some of the terminology can be a bit janky here as well. So generally we have things like learning intentions, inquiry questions, some key focus, and then the success criteria. These can be formal or informal. It could be an exit slip. At the end of this lesson, I want you to have done these 2 things or 3 things. And it becomes part of your, well, have you done this yet, mate? Can I move you on if you haven't done it yet? That sort of stuff. Feedback and feed forward. Providing in oral or written form the existing strengths and areas to address challenges and build further. So, and of course, self-assessment and goal setting is part of the overall culture that you'd want to establish in a classroom. If you can, again, your results may vary. Being a casual teacher, you're answering more fundamental questions about classroom management and getting through the day. Self-assessment is an important tool as well. You can see some of the benefits here. It allows students to take responsibility. So it's part of that transfer of responsibility from the teacher to the student gradually, and happens in a cyclical fashion across units, across lessons, and across years and things like that as well. But it leads to improved self-esteem, more agency, more independence, which are the traits we want to see when they move beyond the kind of mandatory K-10 system of education. So you can see they're not hugely complicated. It could be a little rubric where they write comments, give themselves ticks. They could give peer assessment, which we will. But at this point, you should have done that. Unless you're listening ahead, in week 5, we will have modelled that. A good classic is 2 stars and a wish. If you want it, they can use it on themselves or their peers, where they say, these are the 2 things I like, I wish to see more of, or I'd like to know more about. So instead of saying this is bad, it's projecting forward into, well, in the future, this could be quite cool. So again, constructive feedback modelling. You could do facial sort of stuff as well, like, you know, for younger students, how they felt about their day or learning. And get them to talk to you in their own language as to why. 3-2-1 cards are pretty good too for this sort of meta, self, or peer reflection. 3 things I've learnt about, 2 questions I still have, 1 way this relates to my world. You know, it's similar to the Harvard 1-minute paper stuff that has been modelled as well. There are some useful links there that I have checked them, they all still work, primarily through the assessment material on the K-12, the syllabus site, I think is primarily useful. There is advice from NISA, and I do like to point to NISA to make sure that my stuff is aligned. So if you want to take a quick look at this, they provide some stuff here about recording evidence, looking at students with disability for, as, and of learning are kind of the foundational stuff here as well. Principles of assessment are similar. So again, you can see this idea, it's based on the outcomes, valid. So, you know, we are keeping this, you know, pretty firmly aligned with what NISA is saying as well. So I don't think we're out of step. You know, we're not stuck in the ivory tower. It's not those academics telling you out of date or wacky things. These are the principles. How well those are met on a day-to-day basis, well, the schools are tricky places. You know, I think they're more aspirational elements that we try to strive for, but as people in environments that have challenges, some days we get closer than others. That's what I like to say. It's the same in higher education as well. But you can see those are some of the K-6 strategies, teacher observations, peer and self-assessment, as I discussed, do appear on NISA's site. There are some good self-evaluative questions and prompts here that you could incorporate into your lesson plans, for example. Group work and inquiry-based stuff, and you know, these sorts of things are part of this. So you can see it's already pretty clear that the way NISA frames this and ACARA frames this is, yes, even though there are major forms of assessment going around, they acknowledge in the classroom we need that diversity, that multimodality, you know, that richness of assessment, so that we're assessing what is really matters, skills, application knowledge, and those sorts of things. You know, teachers listening, and viewing and response tasks. So having students create podcasts, all sorts of stuff. There's some really cool things in this. I mean, I think AI can actually will eventually help students sort of transition their work from written to podcast and all sorts of cool things. I think the principle that we'll look at with AI though is the students must put in. You know, you get out what you put in, I think is something I'm thinking about in this space. But look, I'm still a newbie with the AI stuff. Some of my colleagues are more advanced than me. There's some stuff there on PBL. There's some stuff there on like rubric makers. I mean, if you're confident, you can probably just punch one out in Word or whatever. I mean, we're having a go at it is the key thing. If you can produce one to your best effort with what we've provided here for your first assessment task, Part B lesson plans, it'll put you in a good position, and it is in the rubric. So where are we going now? So after we looked at the unit outlines last week, we're now turning our attention, well, not last week, I should say, the last week of learning, week 5 it'll be, it's now week 8. Hopefully you've now been turning your attention to, you know, those lesson plans. Hopefully the mid-semester break that you guys got, not every cohort gets this, gave you a chance to really start thinking about those lesson plans. So, you know, what phase of the years you're looking at, how are you going with the draft? I would say the task is to come to tutorials with some ideas about how you could assess students' learning, and hopefully you bring your draft lesson plans in any form to the unit, to week 8, so that we can start giving feedback there as well. Diversity is a big part of this as well. You know, this is the sort of reality that Jeff Masters, who is the CEO of the Australian Council of Educational Research, sort of pointed to. The most advanced students commencing at any year level can be up to 6 years ahead of the least advanced level. And that is it's not unique globally, but it is a pretty uniquely Australian problem here, where the most advanced 5% of year 3 students already outperform 20% of year 9 students. That's just the world you are going to be operating within. And so differentiation is essential, but this does not require you to ruin yourself by creating 20 or 25 different lesson plans. It can be tiered forms of assessment, you know, basic building into complex, you know, different question prompts, those sorts of things. So there's some advice here on differentiation offered in the syllabus documentation there. I won't go into that now. I'll make the executive decision not to look at that. But again, it sort of builds on essentially this idea of prior knowledge and diagnostic assessment does a big portion of the heavy lifting here as well. There are some 6 traits on peer assessment. We've covered quite a lot of that as well. There are 3 key questions to think about when you think about differentiation assessment. Could most students of this age do the activity? Again, we won't always know that, but those examples that we got from Board of Studies give us some frame of reference here. You'll build that up through experience as well. Should we expect most students to do this activity? Again, more a philosophical point. And would most students of this age want to do the activity? This is a tricky one. Yeah. I generally, if I'm not sure, I generally pitch too hard and work back to easy. This is my feeling. I think people do not like being patronised. There's nothing worse than a teacher that's under pitching, but you can always go in a bit high and peel back. That's my view. Debate me if you'd like. There's some information here on Indigenous perspectives as well. These are quite important. I've got Deadly Science with Corey Tart. We've got Dark Emu as well, that talk about Indigenous perspectives and that some of these sorts of elements. Not every unit is going to include Indigenous perspectives, but there are some resources here that can help you sort of pursue this if it's something that you want to make a key feature of your unit. My advice would be either develop it or don't. Don't have it as a shallow add-on. Develop it or don't include it. That's just my feeling. There's some stuff in here about kind of the depth of Indigenous engagement, sort of the basis of standpoint theory as well. So we generally move throughout our organisations and professional lives through 3 phases, where you go from uninformed, aware, to engaged, to mobilised. So, aware is generally remaining quite abstract, so you might not be engaged in Indigenous communities and mobilised to action. This is not a comment on anyone's standard or where they're at. I, for example, would probably fall into more phase 2 because I'm not teaching Indigenous students with great regularity, and that's a form of where I live and to some extent my professional engagement. So we want to move through those as best we can towards, committed to embedding and beginning to embed these perspectives as best we can. So community partnerships and different pedagogies like 8 Ways are part of this as well. So if you look at embedding Indigenous perspectives, can't just be, we'll get an Indigenous elder in. I mean, it's an extended thing, and you would hope that there's a more institutional approach at the schools that you're in, if it's relevant. It's relevant in the curriculum, but your ability to incorporate this will it's influence you'll have to build over time as an individual teacher. But we want to understand knowledge frameworks. We've got a couple here. A critical understanding of text, understanding Indigenous protocols as well, understanding and using different languages. So appreciating differences between Indigenous English dialects and standard Australian English and those sorts of things. Understanding community, assessment, diversity and reporting. So similar themes, and of course the concept of developing strong community partnerships. So you can't just walk in and say, I want an Indigenous elder. That would be something that the school and yourself would have to develop over a period of time. There are some strategies for embedding Indigenous perspectives in the curriculum. Often focus on stories and narratives can be a really interesting way to go about that, and I think this intersects quite nicely with a lot of the other strategies we've talked about. Focus on content and process. Valuing oral traditions is a big part of this as well. Negotiate terminology or acceptable terminology with your students in different contexts, and really get into the idea of code switching. Now, we need this now, but we can use this, that sort of stuff. Be explicit about intention with regard to language. Showcase success, journaling, focus groups, those sorts of things. So the constructivist ideas that underpin this align very nicely here with some of these principles that we're talking about with Indigenous perspectives. You can look at the 8 Ways as well. You can click on there. I won't play the video. I mean, you can in your own time. Seems a bit unnecessary for me to play a video within a video. But the 8 Ways learning model could be something you consider as well. There's an interesting website here, which is Connection to Living Place. So it's a nice website that begins to... it's gone down now. I thought it was still here. Relevant searches. Oh, it was there literally a week ago. It must have gone down. Anyway, primary mat. So there are some different resources here as well that give you a sense of where Indigenous perspectives in the curriculum are developing that are worth incorporating. I won't go through the cross-curricular integration at this stage because we've been through this. It's there because I think it logically fits if anyone's reading the PowerPoints. So let's go through this. So I'm just mindful of the time for the lectures because we've got a double this week. So the next task will, of course, be to look at the second PowerPoint, which will literally just be me going through the task description, the rubric, and the template, and talking about what the standards look like at each level, so that you can, begin to target the grades that you're seeking. Look, pass is fine. I think the pass is pretty complex and robust. So if you're gunning for a pass and you get it, you've got my seal of approval. But some of you may be looking to take my job and going for high distinctions. So you can use that lecture to strategically go for the grades that you're seeking, and not guess what's in my or the markers' heads. Those are the module units you can look at if you'd like to. Bring at least one draft lesson plan to the tutorial. And draft is very loosely defined. It can be dot points, it can be a fully developed component. The more you put in, the more you'll get. You can come with nothing. That's entirely within your right. There's no grades for this, but I'd recommend you bring something, because having input from your lecturer, your tutor, and your classmates will put you in a better position, because, as I've said many times before, fails tend to be a surprise. We usually look at them and go, who is this student? So not that it's not unprecedented, but that's what they tend to be. And of course, a reminder that assessment 1 is due on Sunday, the 27th of April, 2025, for your records. But anyway, that's it for this first part of the lecture. Tune in for the assessment breakdown in the next lecture.